additional questions.
Okay, Cynthia, I started the recording and I'm hoping it's going to the cloud because it didn't give me a option, but if it comes to my system, I'll make it available to everybody.
Yeah, the button is on my screen, so you're probably
perfect. I guess we're ready to start.
Great. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us, spending some of your Tuesday. We are the AEM Center and the NIMAC. I'm Cynthia Curry. I'm the director of the AEM Center, and this is the third part of what's becoming much more than part 3 of 3. We have added a few more webinars to this series, which we'll share with you toward the end. And as always, part of this series are Joy Zabala and Nicole Gaines. Joy, I know you are on audio, so if you want to introduce yourself, and Nicole, I think you are in the room, but you may be on chat because the last webinar was all about the NIMAC, and this one is the AEM Center describing digital materials. So Nicole, you might introduce yourself in the chat, and Joy, come on over your audio.
Okay, hi everybody. It's nice to see you. It's also nice to see such beautiful familiar names in the attendees list. And I hope that as we go forward, that in addition to us zipping through the content, that you will jump right in and ask questions, make comments. As I look at the group, nobody's a silent person. So we'll be expecting to hear from you as we go along. So that's it. Cynthia, shall we? Go ahead.
All right, we shall. We have some big ideas to share with you throughout the webinar. Joy is going to talk about the rationale for accessibility, why it's important, the meaning of accessible, because we know oftentimes that term is misinterpreted to mean other things. And of course, we have a definition for accessible that's specific to students with disabilities. Joy will talk about the accessibility as it relates to digital materials and technologies and assistive technology. And I'll be speaking to guidance that's available for state education agencies and local education agencies and their procurement procedures. And of course, we always leave you with supportive tools and resources. Joy?
Okie doke. So you can click ahead. And I think there are sort of 2 reasons that we do these, but to me, this is actually the most compelling one, that social justice is the equitable distribution of resources and opportunities in which outside factors that categorize people are irrelevant. And I think that's why it matters. And when we come to digital materials, especially, the way those materials are designed is what makes it irrelevant why someone might have a barrier by some things we'll talk about as we go forward. And the next slide gets into those other reasons why we do this, and that is that we are required to do so by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 2004, when it was last reauthorized, and we're way over time for reauthorization, but it was really talking about printed materials and textbooks, and the related core materials are those things that you would order on the same order form, perhaps, as a textbook. And it doesn't mean it's just related to core subjects. It's related to those materials that go with the textbooks. One of the things that people have difficulty with often is thinking that, and let me go back and position this just slightly differently, because you are people who are leading other people. I absolutely know that you know these things, but to go over them and perhaps provide you with supports that you can use with others is an important thing. Because many people still think that there's a requirement placed on publishers to provide accessible materials, where the requirement through IDEA is actually placed on state and local education agencies. And publishers are only compelled to do this legally by your entering into contracts for purchasing with them and requiring them to make those printed materials accessible primarily through the NIMAS files and through the NIMAC and some other sources. So continue on, please, Cynthia. Again, print and electronic, in 2015, there was actually in the call for proposals for the current AEM Center, this was how accessible educational materials was focused. And basically it's exactly the same as it is with print, except that there's the addition of technology-based educational materials and print and electronic textbooks. So with AEM, it's looking at that whole totality of materials. And what's important is that the AIM that we saw before actually is subsumed into AEM, because it talks about print and technology. So it's not really an either or. This one is the more inclusive statement. So there are also other applicable federal legislations, and there are links to these on the AIM Center website. Section 504 and Section 508 of the Rehab Act also talk about accessibility. Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act, and the Higher Education Opportunity Act also include legislation that relates to the provision of materials in accessible formats to students. So I mentioned a little bit ago that whole notion of instructional materials, educational materials, learning materials. Really what we've sort of tried to do to get that word less of a concern to people, because it does sometimes confuse people, that basically all materials have to be accessible. And so we talk about accessible materials and accessible technologies rather than really worrying too much about what's in the middle. That way, the sort of confounding pieces, or at least one of the confounding pieces of the legal pieces, is put aside a bit. So continue on, please. So the meaning of accessibility, and this is one that I'm really extremely fond of. Continue on. There, Cynthia mentioned that we do have a definition that relates to individuals with disabilities, and this is it, a joint dear colleague letter from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. And, you know, anytime the Department of Justice is involved, it tends to kick the, I'm going to stop for just a second. There are really loud keyboarding clicks coming across. I don't know if somebody can mute their sound. That may not work, but anyway. So, starting again, the functional definition of accessibility is looking at providing students with disabilities with the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interaction, and enjoy the same services as students without disabilities with substantially equivalent ease of use. And I think as we look at that definition, we see that there are some things that perhaps we still have a long way to go on. And I think for me personally, that whole substantially equivalent ease of use is a really big one. And when we look at and talk about today accessible digital materials, you really begin to get even closer to our concerns about that substantially equivalent ease of use. So one of the things that is an ongoing issue and an ongoing discussion is there's this tendency to say, is it accessible? Is this material accessible? Is this technology accessible? And one of the things that we know is that accessibility features that are needed by one individual or group are not necessarily the same accessible features that are useful to another. So we have to think about accessibility as something much broader than one set of things or another set of things. That accessibility is basically a moving target, because certainly within categories of disability, there are some things that would seem to make something more or less accessible. And then we also can think about accessible to, could you go back just a moment, please?
Sorry about that, Joy.
All right.
I'm waiting for your pauses.
Accessible to, oh Lord, then I'm not supposed to think, right? Accessible to whom, where, and for what. And I want to give you a little example of that moving target in the to whom. Someone called one time and said, you know, I'm using all the definitions I'm supposed to be using. I'm trying to make everything work. And I'm thinking about a student who's deaf or hard of hearing, but this is an early childhood person who can't read yet. And so the whole notion of one of the really important things for accessibility for someone who's deaf or hard of hearing, which would be captioning, would not work for this individual. So that to whom becomes an issue as well. Okay, Cynthia, go ahead. So we can see that play out in the next slide, where you see a person who is deaf and hard of hearing. We see someone who's blind, someone who has a severe visual impairment, someone who has autism, but also a learning disability. And on the right-hand side, you see two people with cerebral palsy, one of whom is blind and uses one hand to read Braille, the other of whom is a young child who basically has very little motor control that's works when she wants it to work. So you would know that accessibility might not mean the same things. And what happens a lot, and I'm sure that many of you have faced this as well, is that when people think about accessibility, they often tend to think about it in the context of people who are blind or visually impaired. And while that's critically important, the people that are expected to be served, if you will, under accessibility is a much, much broader group of people. So. And one of the things I think that also stands in our way sometimes is we have this sort of disability approach, and part of that probably comes somewhat to the fact that in the some of the federal statutes there are relationships between accessible materials and people with particular kinds of disabilities. So you look at thinking about increasing accessibility for a student who is deaf or hard of hearing, blindness, low vision, and you can see the other things that are there as well. So let's look at a little bit different approach. Now, Cynthia.
I did. The functional approach?
Thank you. There it is.
You're welcome.
Yes. It just took a little second. So what if we consider the possibility of a functional approach where we're not really looking so much at the reason why somebody cannot do a particular thing, but what is it that's actually creating a barrier? What about a student who needs an alternative for visual information? There may be students who have many reasons why they need that. The same for auditory information, needs support for physical interaction and manipulation, which it takes this out, I think, a lot more broadly rather than saying, do they fit in this disability category or not? Mostly, what is it that is creating a barrier for them? What sort of alternatives do we make sure that we provide or that we make sure are included in the digital materials that we acquire? And so you could, and the reason it says is, and on, is there may be many other things to think about as well. So then when we get to how does all of this relate to accessible materials and technologies? The key thing, and I know that all of you have heard this many times before, is that there are two sides of the AIM coin. One of them is the content, and the other one is the delivery technology or the delivery system. And we have to think carefully both about the way the content is provided, and then also the delivery technology that would be necessary for someone to perceive of and work with that content. So when we think about accessible content, we're looking at sort of all materials, going back to that idea, print or technology-based, that basically when we think about accessible content, those are materials that are designed or enhanced in a way that makes them usable by the widest possible range of student variability. And it isn't just about print, it isn't just about digital, but graphical, audio, video, and you see, and more. You see a lot of that in media-rich digital materials. It may have multiple kinds of things that need to be accessible, and certainly interactivity with all of that too. But with the content, if it's designed to be used as print or born print, it requires retrofitting. And you've heard a lot in the last couple of sessions about that retrofitting, the kinds of things that we have available. Nicole did a beautiful job of helping you not only see what was available in the NIMAC, but the Louis Plus database where you can go and look. You'll be hearing more about Bookshare Learning Ally, and then certainly we'll be talking more about publishers. And then when the content is designed to be used digitally or born digital, it is difficult to retrofit if those accessibility features are not embedded from the start in the design process and the implementation process of those materials. Assistive technology service providers are manufacturers are getting better at taking inaccessible things and making them accessible by features that they put in their programs. But we want to be really careful that we're not just relying on that, because we want to be sure that we're encouraging publishers to have their materials be as accessible as possible with those rich features built into them, because not only are they good for people with disabilities, they're also good for everybody else to be able to have access to and use if or when they either want to or need to. So again, here's the picture that goes with the slide. So continue on. So when we think about accessible technologies, this is an interesting piece because this is where the assistive technology piece comes in. We're looking at the whole notion of whatever it is, device, hardware, software, handheld equipment that provides access to life's activities. And the notion is that it can be used by people across a wide range of disabilities and abilities. So the two pieces that I think are important here are they're directly usable, meaning they come out of the box and you can go without assistive technology because of the way they're designed, or they are compatible and made usable with assistive technology. And for a lot of people, even when the materials appear to be directly usable, if perhaps there may be two kinds of input that's available that are built in, but your student needs something that's very specific to that individual and maybe using assistive technology for input or for perceiving output, that whole notion of interoperability with compatibility between what's being made for everybody and what is needed by an individual. So the notion behind accessible out of the box, you're fine. The notion behind accessible out of the box is that it comes with as much built in as possible, but it also provides that interoperability so that if something else is needed, that assistive technology can be hooked up without you having to go through a great deal of fumbling around. So the Center for Online Learning talks about if indeed we have problems with accessibility, they could be eliminated if there were various and redundant modes such as speech, text, and graphics that make it possible to deliver content based not only on individuals and disabilities, but also on learner preferences. And what happens a lot of times, and those of you who, I think most of you that are here know Diana Carl, and she talks about, yeah, but you know, that redundancy thing, that doesn't sound like a good thing. And so let's look at the next slide. In this particular thing, redundancy is a good thing. And if we think like an engineer for a moment, then we look at redundancy as if something doesn't work, there's another way to do the same thing. It's not superfluous or unneeded or too much. And accessibility, we're thinking about it as critical because of that one feature or format or one way of doing things is not available to an individual. There's another feature or format that is available that conveys the same information and provides the same interactivity. I think that's just a really, really important little piece right there, that in accessibility piece from down. That's something that you might really want to share, particularly if you talk about redundancy and the importance of redundancy, just to make it clear to people. So what we learned is that accessibility is increased if those multiple options are built in, and they can be turned off or on depending on an individual's needs or preferences. And another very critical piece is that everybody that's involved knows what those options are, and they can participate in the selection of the options they need, and they know how to manipulate the options. I remember a long time ago, there was a group of a large body of software that was provided to people free of charge from the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium called MEC software. And it had all these wonderful teacher options that you could use. And all you had to do was push Control-T and this menu came up. But I don't know how many people I ran into, literally hundreds and hundreds of people who had used MEC software for years and never knew about the Control-T. And so knowing what the options are, how to find them, and how to manipulate them is a critical piece of making this actually happen.
Great. And Joy, I'd like to pause at this point because we're going to be moving on to guidance to SEAs and LEAs, and that was a lot of information. So I thought maybe we would just pause and see if there are any questions or comments. We are a small group, which can make a conversation intimate, which can be helpful during a webinar. So if anybody has any questions or comments about, we've been talking about the accessibility, what accessibility means, definition for accessibility as it relates to materials, as it relates to technologies, that those are two sides of the AIM coin.
I think the other thing, Cynthia, that you actually put in the chat it's really important when we think about that accessible definition is the equally integrated, equally effective as well. Not just equal ease of use, but all three of those pieces together are really important.
Yeah, I agree that the notion of regardless of whether it's a technology or a material, even if it is if it's an instructional strategy, I mean, this is what makes universal design for learning so powerful, is that for it to be accessible to all students, that whatever that is needs to be equally integrated, meaning that a student doesn't have to go about accessing it in a different way or through a different curriculum or through different strategies. It's equally integrated and it's equally effective, meaning that they have the same opportunity for achievement and progress as students who may be using the traditional equipment or curriculum.
I think there's one other vocabulary piece. I tend to be falling into the vocabulary place a lot. And I noticed it today on something I was looking at, but I hadn't noticed it before, is that when we use the word accessible, and we're talking about accessibility, being able to participate, be involved, and all of that, people often use that term accessible when they really mean available. They would say, oh, yes, it's accessible 24/7. No, well, indeed, that is how people use that word, and it's not an incorrect use of the word, but if we could start using the word available when we really mean available, rather than making that a bit confusing with the accessible word. And you'll find that the more you reach out and are involved with general education, and I think, Debbie, you could probably speak to this better than I can, you do have that use of its accessible meaning available quite a good bit.
And Joy, when you say that tends to be an interpretation of the term accessible in general education, where I've seen it really emerge is with open educational resources. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of publications, a lot of discussions around open education resources is that they are accessible, but they are in that context, they're talking about OERs being free, open mm-hmm. source, searchable, low cost, and that's not what we're talking about here. Right. We're talking that as you've described means available. Those are right. Available materials. The term accessible really should be reserved in education in the context of access for all students in terms of their unique characteristics and learning needs.
So now we've chatted. How about y'all?
Joy, that was very educative. Thank you. I always learn something when the two of us talk.
Me too.
So we'll go ahead and move on to guidance for state education agencies and local education agencies when it comes to your procurement processes. And by procurement, we use that term broadly. So whether it's something that's being purchased or something that's being selected, something that's being created, all of that falls under procurement processes in the pursuit of having accessible materials and technologies provided to students at the point of learning. So some resources that we have at the AEM Center, one is the PALM. PALM stands for Purchase Accessible Learning Materials, but you could replace the term purchase with procure. Joy,
and I think we're going to do that, right?
Yep. Joy suggested it could be choose accessible learning materials, and you could get COM.
Actually, Chris Bouguet suggested that, and I thought it sounded like anything that sounds like COM sounds good to me.
Yeah, or it could be providing accessible learning materials. At any rate, so we are, as Joy mentioned, we're in the process of revising the PALM because of some things that have changed, obviously, in the last few years around the options and the complexities around digital materials and technologies. But even when it changes, you'll still find some foundational things as part of the POM. One is that there's draft purchase order and contract language available in the POM that your agency can use. You can adapt that, or you can use it as is. Obviously, you probably want to make that language, that accessibility language, your own. So that would be the what you insert in your purchase order or contract that puts vendors on notice that you expect whatever they are going to be proposing for purchase from your agency is going to be accessible. And there's some language around that in terms of what does that mean? What is the information that you should be giving to vendors in that statement? It also includes best practices for publishers and developers. So obviously the POM is not just a tool for procurers of materials and technologies, but also for those who develop those products. Also includes action steps for purchasers, for educators, for families, and for the student advocates. And there's a link to this. You'll find, I believe that Leslie gave you a link earlier to the events page for this webinar, and you'll find both this PowerPoint as well as a handout, a digital handout that has links to all of the resources that we're referring to, including the POM. Another helpful resource is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. 2.0 level AA is what's recommended. So these are international standards. These guidelines have been around for a long time. They have recently been elevated to being aligned, or the Section 508 standards of the Rehabilitation Act have been aligned to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that means that we have some consistency for publishers and ed tech developers around what is it that is required of them in order to make their products accessible. There are 3 levels. One is A, the second is AA, and the third is AAA. What's commonly recommended in what Section 508 holds publishers and vendors to is AA. So they're developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, the Web Accessibility Initiative, and this is an example of some guidelines and standards that you'll find in the POM initiative, and some guides that you can use when you're communicating with vendors and publishers around what you mean by accessible. When you use that word, you don't mean free or easily discovered or open. You really mean accessible in terms of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or Section 508 of the Rehab Act. An acronym that came out of WCAG 2.0 is a series of principles that have been given the acronym POUR, P-O-U-R. The 4 words that make up POUR are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So these are sort of 4 comprehensive principles that when you're either selecting your own materials, creating your own materials, choosing materials for your students, you're in the market purchasing materials, that these 4 terms can be used as a guide. So by perceivable, we're referring to making sure that students with wide-ranging sensory abilities can understand the information through seeing, hearing, ultimately feeling, but we know, although I think we're going to be seeing some technologies soon that allow for some tactile interactivity with students, but allowing them multiple ways to interact through various senses. Operable, meaning that students can interact with information using a variety of tools, so that technology or that material is interoperable with their assistive technology or their specialized software. If it's understandable, it means that students can understand it, that they have access to the information regardless of what level they may be reading at or listening at, and that information is predictable, that it's organized and structured in a way that students can follow. And if it's robust, it means that the digital material works well with current and future technologies. So if a student's assistive technology or their specialized software changes, that material will continue to work with their existing technology.
I think most of us too have had the opportunity to see a piece that when it was updated, it didn't work anymore. And so that's really what we're trying to get away from, that upgrading or updating to another iteration of a material or should not take away the features that it had before, but enrich those features as it moves forward.
Yeah, I think, Joy, you're right. We often hear of a material that somebody will ask, well, it's new, it's just been launched, maybe a software program, or maybe it's an ebook, and somebody with concern about access via screen readers might say, well, is that accessible to JAWS or VoiceOver? And sometimes the answer is, well, if you have the most recent version, or if you bought it yesterday, then yes, it is. And of course, that's not what we want. We want to make sure that people don't, people who use assistive technology don't have to make additional purchases in order to be able to interact and benefit from the most contemporary technologies and materials. We on the AEM Center website have a brand new section called Designing for Accessibility with POUR. Our colleague, our new technical assistant specialist, Luis Perez, developed this section for us. I just took a screenshot of a video that opens that section, but you will find the link is in the, it's both in the handout, and Leslie has put the link in the chat. When you go there, you will find that we have a series of how-tos related to each of the principles under POUR. So examples for what, some of the things that you can do to make your materials perceivable for students. What are examples of what makes materials operable, understandable, and robust? And that section is really focused on what teachers can be doing at the classroom level. It's not at the state or the local level. We're really designing, that section was really designed with teachers in mind, and what are they choosing, what are they creating for their students. There are 5 things that we have identified recently that agencies, state and local agencies, and even schools, when they are choosing particular products to purchase for all students, choosing something that's aligned with a certain curriculum in a school district or a particular grade level product. What are 5 things that you can do to make sure that what is selected, what ultimately is purchased, is going to be accessible? And these 5 things obviously may be a little bit misleading in terms of coming across a little bit simpler than it probably is in practice, but these are really important things that that you can have available to you as you go about the process. So these 5 things can be integrated into an existing protocol or best practices. So the first thing is to require that all educational materials and technologies be accessible, whether you're setting this this standard for a state level or a local level or for a school. If a teacher wants to set this as a stance for themselves, it's important, because if you don't have this stance, then obviously some learners are going to continue to experience access barriers, plain and simple. The second is to incorporate accessibility into your procurement practices. So using the WCAG 2.0 AA or Section 508 conformance, use that for your criteria in communications with vendors and publishers. The third is to include accessibility language in contracts and purchase orders. And of course, the POM that we just introduced you to has sample language. And that's for both digital and print materials, because there's a distinction between those. You can ask vendors for a voluntary product accessibility template, also known by the acronym VPAT. This is a self-assessment, a self-report by a vendor on the accessibility of their product. It was just revised to a 2.0 version, so it was recently revised. It's aligned with the Section 508 WCAG 2.0 AA standards, and the vendors essentially reporting the accessibility according to those standards. It's just one piece of information. One thing to look for is if the information that's reported by the vendor is spotty, if it seems incomplete. It gives you an opening to ask them why, and start the conversation about accessibility, because the VPAT, if you're using that sort of as a tool, then it's a point of conversation that you can enter into with a vendor to say, this is what I mean by accessible, and tell me more about your VPAT. Recruiting students with unique access and learning needs. So before making a purchase, try out the technology, ask some of your students who use assistive technology and specialized software to test it out. Make sure that it's not just trying the technology out in a vacuum, but give them some purpose, some context for using the technology for the reason that you were about to make the purchase. So give them an authentic task, observe how they interact with the technology, ask them some questions about their user experience, and with that, keep the definition of accessible in mind. So the question would be, will this student be able to use the product in an equally effective, equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use? And if there's evidence that the student wouldn't be able to use this for a curriculum that is expected for all students to make progress, then there should be some questions about whether or not that technology or material should be purchased. Some supportive tools and resources that we'll leave you with. Of course, the AEM Center, our website has a wealth of information at aem.cast.org. The search field is excellent. So if there's something that you're looking for from today's presentation and you want a shortcut to find it, I suggest that you enter it into the search, and it will come up as one of the very first results of your search. You'll find the new section that we were just referring to on designing for accessibility with POUR. You'll find that under the Creating AEM tab of our site. And something that we didn't include in today's presentation, which was an oversight, but we do have quality indicators that are fairly new for the provision of AEM, and those quality indicators are for both K-12 and higher ed. You'll find those under policies and systems, and you can be on the lookout for the AEM Center to be developing some more resources, and we'll hold a webinar on how to use those quality indicators in the near future. One of the most popular resources on the AEM Center website is the Simply Said video, Understanding Accessibility in Digital Learning Materials, and this is based off of the Common Craft video, so it's very clever, really puts AEM in simple terms for people who are just learning what accessibility means as it relates to technology and materials, but most importantly, what it means to individual students and getting access to learning experiences, and again, particularly in the general education environment. SETDA, the State Education Technology Directors Association, has a database known as the Digital Instructional Materials Acquisition Policies for States. This is an interactive database. So you can choose your state, you can choose another state, you could choose to compare your state against 4 other states in terms of multiple topics that have to do with policy. And SETDA has included accessibility data within the DMAPS. So you could find things related to, does the state have a definition for accessibility of educational materials? Does the state have accessibility within the procurement policies? And not only that, but you can obviously compare states along other areas that are important to procurement policies.
And I think, and it's important probably to note that Debbie and Victoria, both of whom are on this call, were active participants in creating what those fields would be. And there's a lot of stuff in there from Florida and Texas and many other states, but have a look at them and see what it says.
Yeah, it's a terrific resource. And for those of you who are not from Texas or Florida, those would be good states to look at when you go into DMAPS. Comparing your state against another state like Texas or Florida that has made a lot of progress in this area, you can use that to bring to some of the other decision makers in your state to say, these are what Texas and Florida are doing, and they're really models for improving accessibility materials for students in their states, and what can we learn from them. So we do have a couple of minutes, Joy. We've done well.
I was going to say, we've only talked at 400 words per minute.
So we do have a couple of minutes for questions. I will just wrap things up while you consider those, and know that you have access to the chat while we're finishing up if there's some things that you want to ask or comment on. We have some additional webinars coming up as part of our series. So these 3 upcoming webinars are specifically for our AIM State contacts and NIMAC coordinators. On March 27th, we have Bookshare joining us. On April 5th, Learning Ally, and on May 9th, American Printing House for the Blind. Notice that those are all different days and they're all different times. So that's our challenge to you. If you make sure that you get these on your calendars. We were accommodating multiple organizations, obviously, in their schedules, but all of these organizations will be joining us and customizing their presentation for the needs of the AIM State contacts and NIMAC coordinators. All of them have information for you on how to streamline access to copyrighted materials for students with print disabilities, and the eligibility criteria for each of their services and how those services work, both in terms of signing students up as well as how they work technologically.
I think too, there's a sort of a companion to this on the AIM Center website, which is called the AIM Guide to AMPS, Accessible Media Producers, and it actually has quite a nice grid that displays Bookshare, Learning Ally, and APH's what they do, how you go about getting involved. It's just quite a nice side-by-side comparison that you can look at. And so that would be worth having a look at too.
Yeah, so I just put that in the chat, AIM Guide to AMPS. Thanks, Joy. And if you put that in the search field at the AIM Center website, it will come right up. So in conclusion, we have the contact information for the AIM Center. Leslie also just copied and pasted this into the chat. Thanks, Leslie. We also have contact information for Nicole at the NIMAC, and we know Nicole was quiet today, but she has not been so quiet in past webinars, and there's a lot of information from the NIMAC. But we decided for parts 2 and 3 of our webinar series that we would, the first webinar, as you know, if you attended, was both organizations sharing information about our centers separately, and then Nicole gave an excellent overview of the NIMAC in part 2, and then Joy and I
gave a really fast
AIM
one.
Center. Yes, we were I think we did well. Leslie just put the link to the survey in the chat. Thanks, Leslie. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have suggestions specifically on what else the AIM Center and the NIMAC can be doing to support AIM contacts and NIMAC coordinators, please don't hesitate to include that in the survey. We'd appreciate knowing what additional assistance that you all could use, and we will certainly respond to that.
And I would say thank you for hanging in there with us for this last hour. And hopefully some of the fumphering around was at least mildly entertaining in your day. So that's it. It's just been nice to be here with you yet again.
A pleasure. And Brenda asked if we could provide a copy of the PowerPoint, and Leslie put the link to today's events page where you'll find the PowerPoint and a digital handout for today earlier in the chat, but maybe Leslie could drop that there, and she did. So Brenda, and you'll just see the link that Leslie just dropped, and that will take you to the event page for today, and that has both the PowerPoint and the digital handout for today's webinar. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.